Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me again to talk. Tonight's topic is controversial. You debated whether you should talk about it here. I once gave this talk many years ago now in Heathlands, which, for those of you who don't know, is the old people's home in Manchester. I thought it was very appropriate, actually, but there were one or two people who didn't think it was appropriate, and I had to pay the price. But anyway, let's look at it with fresh eyes. The subject, I think the title, we called it Murder or Mercy. Answer: murder or mercy? Hands up those that think it's murder. Hands up those that think it's mercy. Hands up those that think it's both. Okay, interesting. Right, let's see where we get to. I'm going to first of all talk generally about the issue, and then I'm going to give you a bit of a halachic perspective, and then I'm going to see how Israel deals with this, because, of course, we don't live in a halachic state, but we do live in a state where halakha is important and where the laws take cognizance of the halakha, if we put it that way. It's not a halachic state. I don't think any of us would like to really live in a real halachic state, because there would be a great deal of compulsion to do things that we might not want to do. But I think it's right. I think most of us would want to live in a state that takes notice of what the halacha has to say. And we'll see towards the end how that plays out in Israel. But just first of all, to start the ball rolling. And by the way, feel free to interject. Yes.
I would like to know the technical difference between euthanasia and assisted dying.
Okay.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, what's the difference between euthanasia and assisted dying? Okay. Let's define our terms all the way across to start with. The word euthanasia, where's that come from?
Greek.
Greek. What does it mean?
Self-assisted dying. Self.
Okay, the word EU in Greek, you, means, anybody know?
Self.
No. Means pleasant, as in utopia.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so EU means pleasant, and the other part of the word, another Greek word, thanatos.
Death.
Death. Okay, so euthanasia, the definition, the translation of the word euthanasia is a pleasant death. Now, it has come to mean something else, but that's where it all started. The word euthanasia means a pleasant death. It's come to become the umbrella term for all sorts of different things, of which assisted dying is one. So euthanasia is a broad umbrella term which includes assisted suicide. Okay, that means somebody wants to end their own life and needs assistance to do it. And so that's one of type of euthanasia. Then there is active euthanasia, whereby somebody does an action deliberately to shorten somebody's life. And then there is passive euthanasia, where somebody doesn't do something in order that a life will come to an end. So, take a silly example of the latter. If somebody cuts themselves with a sharp glass that breaks and they sever their brachial artery, okay, and they start pumping out blood, if somebody doesn't do something about that, they will die because they'll bleed out. So if you were there and you didn't do something about it, and you were just stood there and you said, oh, look at that, that's a lot of blood, then that would be a passive act where you didn't do something to save somebody's life. So if you did that deliberately and the person wanted to die, then that would be passive euthanasia. But the distinction I want to make is between active euthanasia, where a person does a physical act to bring about the shortening of somebody's life, and passive euthanasia. We'll go into that in some detail later on. So, what have we said? We said euthanasia is an umbrella term. It includes passive euthanasia, active euthanasia, assisted suicide. What are the types of type of euthanasia do we have? Well, we have the withdrawal of things that are keeping you alive. So is that passive or is that active, or that's sort of somewhere in between the two? So and we'll give examples as we go along. So to answer your question right from the beginning, does that answer your question? Euthanasia is a blanket term, and then within that term you've got different little bits of it which we're going to go into as we go along. Okay, so if there are any other questions, just either shout out or stick up your hand, and we'll deal with them as we go along. So just some general comments first of all. Until fairly recently, when I say fairly recently, let's say the last 70 years, where does that take us to? 1950s. Okay, yeah. So until the 1960s, let's say, this subject didn't really come into the consciousness at all. It started to come in as a counterpoint to the idea of organ transplantation. Now, of course, the big time of organ transplantation that started all this off was 1967, of course. We had a kidney transplant before that, but what happened in 1967? Christian Barnard, yes, the first heart transplant. Now, that brought into effect the need to consider what is death. Until then, everybody knew what death was. Death was
Brain dead.
no.
Heart dead.
There was no such thing as brain dead before 1967. That's the point. Before 1967, if your heart was beating and you were breathing, then you were alive. And if your heart was not beating and you were not breathing, then you were dead. It was very simple. Now, the problem was that once heart transplantation came into the consciousness and it came to be possible, you needed to have donors. You needed to have people whose heart could be transplanted into the recipient. The heart had to be beating while it was put in. Once it was stopped, it couldn't be restarted. So that meant you had to take out a beating heart out of a human being and put it into another human being. That's how it worked. Now, if we then say, hang on a minute, if your heart is beating, you are alive, and I take out your heart whilst it's still beating and I give it to Fred next door, what have I done to you? I've killed you. And in fact, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who I'm sure you've all heard of, the greatest American posek of the 20th century, was asked in 1967 for his opinion on heart transplant, and he declared it to be a double murder. A murder of the donor, for the reasons that we've said, and a murder of the recipient because it wasn't going to work. Now, of course, if he was here to ask us, he certainly wouldn't say it was a double murder, because there are thousands, maybe millions now, I don't know, of recipients of heart transplants who are alive and well. But the debate remains in Jewish circles, in rabbinic circles. There are fierce debate about whether there is such a thing as brain death. Because brain death was an artificial concept brought in in 1967 to facilitate heart transplant, because you can't go killing one person to put a heart in somebody else. So then you have to have a dead person to take the heart out of, but it's beating. So what does that mean? It means that you have to develop and invent a new definition of death. And some very clever chaps in a place who you might have heard of, Harvard, came up with something called, which we come to be known as the Harvard criteria, okay, for brainstem death. And they came up with a definition of death, which did not necessarily mean that the heart had to stop. So you could be brain dead and still have a beating heart. If you were brain dead and that particular jurisdiction in which you were accepted the definition of brain death as death, then you weren't killing A to take his heart out and to give it to B, because it was already dead. You can't kill somebody who's already dead. So that's where we got brain death from. Now, so what's that got to do with our subject tonight? It's got a lot to do with our subject, because on the back of that, what happened then was that the definition of death has changed. Okay? And so that means that you can have a situation whereby a person can be technically old-fashionedly alive and yet potentially dead. Somebody who's got a brain problem. And so then the question comes like this, and this is unfortunately a scenario that happens too often. The first time I came across it as a doctor, where I had to advise, was maybe more than 30 years ago perhaps, but a long time ago. A young lad, 17, out with his mates on a Motzei Shabbat in the car, larking around, no seatbelt, and the worst thing ever happened. And he was brain dead, according to the hospital. The then question, and of course he's put on a life support machine where his breathing is done for him and his heart is still beating. But according to the criteria, he's brain dead. So then we have to decide, well, what do you do? The hospital wanted to pull the plug because they said, well, we're just ventilating a corpse. The family didn't want to let him go. Understandably. So they consulted and said, well, what's the halacha? And we had a very big debate and big question about it. At that time, still now, I was one of the advisors to the rabbinic council at that time, because I've been talking about this particular subject for a very long time. Vivian's nodding her head there. You probably heard this a few times, Vivian. I think the very first time I did, I can actually tell you when it was, because my third son, Bobby, who nobody can forget if they've ever known him, was just a toddler, just learned to walk. And I was a lecturer at Jewish youth study groups, for any of you Brits that have, you're a study group, huh? Yeah, another study group. Okay, so I was a lecturer at study group, and he was toddling around in Carmel College, where it was. And that was the very first time I gave this series of lectures on medical ethics. He's now 34, so it's a while ago. Anyway, we had this discussion, and the halacha was decided at that time, although I have to say that this was in Manchester, which is renowned for being just about as machmir, as strict as you possibly can. So this was, they took the very strictest view. There was that it was not permitted to pull out the plug on this boy. They did it anyway, but they did it without the consent. They didn't need the consent because the law of the land was that he was dead. So they didn't need consent. Obviously, they wanted consent. They weren't there to make the family any more distressed than they already were. But that's just to give you an idea of the questions that arose in that situation. So that's how it all began. It began with the concept of brain death. And then, since then, it has developed into this idea of being able to end one's own life because of one word, which is a very emotive word and very popular at the moment in today's society, and that is autonomy. Okay, what does autonomy mean? I would like to.
Independence.
Independence, yes, that's a good definition. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Choice, self-choice. So all of those things, self-determination, choice, independence, all of those things are encompassed in that word autonomy. It's a big deal at the moment, isn't it? I can choose whatever I like. If I choose to, what's the word they use? Identify, that's right. If I choose to identify as a chair, then you have to accept my choice to identify as a chair, right? That's how it works today. Unless you happen to be in America and President Trump has now decided that there are only two sexes, male and female. Okay, let's not go there. But you get the idea. Autonomy is a big deal at the moment. And part of autonomy is that I have the independent, self-determinative right to choose when I die. That is where this whole thing has come from. And then, of course, it goes on from there as not just being autonomy for yourself, but having choices for others, and others being forced or encouraged to follow your choice. So autonomy is the secret to the modern approach to euthanasia. Yes, Philip?
Is non-resuscitation autonomy?
Part of it, yes. If you choose not to be resuscitated, that is part of this debate, which we will come to. Remind me later. Now, on the other side of the equation to autonomy, there is another word which, as Orthodox Jews, we will be more comfortable with the concept, and that is sanctity. Okay? Sanctity. You'll all have heard of the concept of the sanctity of life. What do you understand by that, Avril? Sanctity of life. I saw you mouthing the words. What does it mean to you?
Sacred.
Life is sacred. What does sacred mean?
Holy.
Holy. What does holy mean?
God.
Belongs to God. Thank you very much. So if you believe in the sanctity of life, then by definition, you don't believe in autonomy when it comes to your life. Because life cannot belong to you and belong to God at the same time. Or can it? Right? On the face of it, that's a stira. It's a contradiction. And it is a contradiction. There are blurry bits in the middle, but basically, the Orthodox approach is that life is sacred. Life does not belong to us. If you have a look, those of you, did you print out this one, End of Life Issues? Yeah. If you have a look in there on page, the second page, there's the 1, 2, 3, fourth paragraph down, there's some Hebrew writing. If it was in colour, it would be in red, but it's slightly paler. And below that is the translation of it. This is from Pirkei Avot. You not got that one? Okay, I'll read it to you. It doesn't matter. I'll read it to you. Pirkei Avot says this: "And know that all is according to the reckoning, and let not your impulse assure you that the grave is a place of refuge for you." In other words, it's telling you, don't think that once you're dead, you've escaped punishment. And this is the important bit. The next bit says, "For against your will you were formed, against your will you were born, against your will you live, and against your will you will die." and against your will you will give an account and reckoning before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. So that's mission in Pirkei is really telling us, you need to behave yourselves, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to give an account. But within there, it's telling us the concept that we are born against our will. We don't choose the time that we can be born, and we don't choose the time that we will die. It's not in our power. That's what Pirkei is saying, because these are things that are the sole domain of God. Okay? So, if you believe that, then clearly choosing the time of death, which is basically what any form of euthanasia is, what you're saying is, I am going to choose the time of death.
Or suicide.
Same thing. That's the same thing. Suicide is a it's the same thing. We are saying here, Pirkei what is teaching us here, that this is not our business. When we die, is the sole domain of God. And again, if you look at the next page, those of you who've got it, there's another quote here, which comes from the book of Job, and it says like this. And you'll be familiar with a little bit of this. I'll read it in Hebrew first, because you'll recognize some of the Hebrew. Vayomer, and he said, Arom yatzati mi beten imi. Naked I came out of my mother's womb, va'arom ashuv shama, and naked I shall return there. Hashem natan, va'Hashem lakach. God has given, and God has taken away. Yehi Shem Hashem Bavorach. May Hashem's name be blessed. So we're familiar with that, aren't we? Hashem Natan, Hashem Lakach. We're familiar with that. That's what we hear at every funeral, at a shiva. It's a terrible thing. We've lost somebody. But we, as Jews of faith, recognize that this pasuk from the book of Job says we recognize and we acknowledge and we state and we affirm Hashem Natan, Hashem gave us this life, Hashem Lakach, and God has taken it away. God has taken it away, in brackets, and God has chosen when to take it away. So there is sufficient scriptural proof that the basic starting point for Jewish philosophy is that life is sacred, it has sanctity, it belongs to God. God has, as it were, the right, and only God has the right to decide when that life will end. But it's not completely black and white, because there is a very, very difficult concept, which sounds simple, but when you break it down, which we're going to try and do over the next few minutes, it's not simple at all. When you turn over to the next page, I didn't number these pages, I'm not being clever on me, was it? It's on the 4th page, and it's in the middle of the page, and it's in bold, and it's underlined. And I'm going to read it out to you, because this is the crux of the matter of Pi Halacha. To put it simply, we must ask ourselves, are we extending life, or are we prolonging death? Now that is a very, very difficult question to ask. We believe that life is sacred. We believe that it has sanctity. Somebody mentioned the word holiness. Okay? If life has holiness, then every part of life has holiness. We say in Tehillim, we say it every morning in davening, Kol Haneshama Tahale Ya. What does that mean? It means Kol Haneshama, every soul, Tahale Ya, praises God. Every soul is a praise of God. On the one hand, it's telling us that we, as the owner, or at least the keeper of a soul, has an obligation to praise God. But at another level, it's telling you something else. It's telling you that every soul is a praise of God. Now, if every soul is a praise of God, then every part of that soul is infinite infinity cannot be divided. There's a rabbinic drush on that passage that says, don't read the word as kol haneshama Hallelujah, but kol neshima Hallelujah. What does neshima mean?
Every breath.
Every breath. Neshima is a breath. It's the same root of the word as neshama, of course, because how did we get a neshama? God breathed it into us. So it's the same root of the word. So if you then read it as the rabbi suggests to us, kol neshima Hallelujah, every breath is a praise of God, then we do not have any right to reduce the number of breaths, as it were, in other words, to shorten a person's life. So, it is recognized Jewish philosophy, embodied in Halakha, that we are commanded to extend life wherever we can. So, it is a mitzvah to extend somebody's life. If you can save somebody's life, what's that told? What are we told? You saved the whole world.
Yeah.
He who saves one soul of Israel, as if he saved the whole world. So, saving somebody's life is a mitzvah. What we are not commanded to do is to prolong somebody's death. Now, this is a very difficult concept to get your head around, because it's a very thin and sometimes blurry line between extending somebody's life and prolonging their death. So, if we take, before trying to tease out exactly what it means, if we accept the concept that one not only does not have to prolong death, it is forbidden to prolong death, and I'll show you why in a minute. That means that once somebody has entered the process of dying, dying is not a binary thing. Okay, you're not either, well, it is, I suppose. You're either alive or you're dead. That's fairly binary. But the process of getting from one to the other is not instantaneous. It can be instantaneous, but it can take a long time. So once a person has entered the process of dying, then it is not correct to say, oh, kol neshama hallelujah, kol neshima hallelujah. I've got to make sure that this person has an extra 30 seconds of life, because those 30 seconds are a praise of God. No, that's not the case. We've stopped extending life and we've started to prolong death in that situation. Now, the secret and the hard part is to know when you have crossed over to that point of prolonging death rather than extending life. Now, the halakha helps you a little bit, although it has needed a little bit of updating as time has gone on, because there is a halakha of something called a goses. Anybody know what a goses is?
Something is expiring.
Okay, that's a little bit more detail than that. Yes, Rachel. A goses is somebody who is in the process of dying, and the halakha helps us by saying that a goses is somebody who is not expected to live more than 3 days. Okay. Now, what are the halachot of a goses? Anybody know? What are you meant to do with a goses, somebody who is in that position?
In theory, make it a pleasant way of death, the approaching death, not to exacerbate any pain or distress.
All of those things are correct. Anybody else like to add? He said not to make it exacerbate the pain, to make it as easy as possible to go.
Sorry, you're upsetting me because I did exactly what you're talking about. My husband was dying, and then when you died, it's an illness, very amyloidosis. I'm sure you know about it. And I said, "Can you help him, please?" And I think they did.
Okay, we'll I'm sure that's very upsetting, and I'm sorry if what I'm saying is upsetting. There's no easy way to discuss this subject without being, treading on personal ground. So I apologise if anything I'm saying is upsetting anybody. Certainly not my intention. The simple answer of what the halacha tells you to do with a ghost face is nothing. You're not even allowed to move him or touch him or do anything unless it is to make him more comfortable. So in other words, once a person has entered that process of dying, exactly as you said, what's your name, sorry?
Harvey Green.
Thank you, Harvey. Exactly as Harvey has said, when you're in that process, the job of those around them is to make this process of dying as easy as possible. Okay. So, for example, the Mishnah tells us that some Kabbalistic thing that I don't really understand, but apparently, if there is certain noises going on outside, this prevents the neshama from leaving. And the Gemara gives an example, the Mishnah, gives an example, whereby there is a wood chopper outside, and this person is inside in the process of passing away. He's a ghost face. The halacha is that you go outside and you tell the wood chopper to stop chopping his wood in order to allow the neshama to leave. In other words, you are actually speeding up the death, because you might think you go to the wood chopper and say, keep chopping, because as soon as you stop, he's going to pass away. No, the opposite. The opposite. It's not our job to keep people alive when they're already dying, when the process of dying has started. So that Mishnah, one sec, I'll just finish this sentence and I'll come to you. That Mishnah is a very, very important concept because it teaches us that once the process of dying has started, our role is completely switched on its head. It goes from making sure that we keep somebody alive because we have to extend a life, to ensuring that their passing is not delayed, impeded. Yes?
In some caring situation, the family will be asked to give permission to the sick person to depart. Is there a halachic norm of permission?
You mean this?
Parents might say to the family, need to give permission to the sick person to
Okay, it's an interesting question. I'll just repeat the question for the recording. The question was, in certain situations, the caring team have asked the relatives that they should give permission to the sick person to leave them. I think that the philosophy behind that, and I'm sure you've all got examples, are that whilst Pirkei Avot tells us that actually it's God who decides when we pass away, I'm sure you can all think of examples of people who've hung on until, I don't know, a grandchild is born or a bar mitzvah or a wedding that they're hanging on for, and they get to that event, and then they have that event, and they then, shortly afterwards, they pass away. And there seems to be a certain degree of will, fight, whatever it is. And it may well be that a person is hanging on, as it were, inverted commas, because they don't want to upset the family. And so therefore, by the family saying, we're ready for you to pass on to better places, that, as it were, calms them down, reduces their stress level, and can help the passage be a more pleasant passage. And it can be a euthanatos, can be a more pleasant death. That, if you accept that psychological point, which you've made, is a very good point, then that's another aspect of euthanasia that I didn't mention before. But that would certainly be permitted in halacha. And in fact, there is there's a Gemara that talks about and I don't remember the rabbi who was dying. The Talmidim, his pupils, were praying for his recovery, and they were told by the Ein Abayit there, stop praying for his recovery, because your prayers are preventing his soul from departing. So that's a similar sort of idea. So, are we extending life or are we prolonging death? This is the question that we have to ask ourselves. Now, once we enter the prolonging death situation, we are not allowed to do anything to prolong that death. So, Philip, I think you mentioned the DNAR.
Yeah.
DNAR stands for do not attempt resuscitation. If somebody has started the process of dying, a person is in a terminal illness, whatever it is, however you define that, and of course defining that is very individual to each case, but assuming that somebody has started the process of dying, al pi halacha, to attempt resuscitation would be wrong. Now, not everybody knows this. So what you have, particularly in less knowledgeable but more orthodox circles, let's put it that way, what you have is this overwhelming desire to fulfill the mitzvah of prolonging life, and so by doing, they end up committing the Aveirah of prolonging death, because they say, no, I'm not going to sign the DNAR, because whatever happens, you've got to keep them alive as long as possible. And that's not right. Al pi halacha, that is not right. It's not always known or accepted, but that is the halacha. So it's very important to recognise that we have an obligation not to prolong death. So what are we doing for time? Okay. Let's talk now. Yes. Good question. Let me repeat the question. The question is, who decides when the time of ghost days arrives? That has to be an informed decision, obviously, so it has to involve the doctors.
Medical.
Has to be medical for sure, but it also needs some. If we're talking about in Orthodox Jewish circles, there has to be some rabbinic input as well, because you can have a situation whereby the doctors actually don't think that this person is terminally ill in the halachic terms, but actually halachic terms they are. I'll give you an example of how the difference, how it can be. Quite often halacha is more strict than medicine. Some of you may know that I am a lawyer, and one of the things that we, especially in Manchester, get a bit het up about is jaundice. And you often have a situation where a doctor will say, this baby's fine to have a bris. He's got a bit of jaundice, so what? He'll be gone in a day or two. And many Morning will say, no, we don't do it. Bris, if there's got to be no jaundice at all, zero. And they go and put them under the light, right? And they're looking for the minutest bit of yellow. Halacha it can be, if it's interpreted that way, strict. So to answer your question, it's a medical diagnosis, but there has to be some halachic input as well. And I have to say, my experience over 30 years in working in England is that the doctors are almost universally happy for the family and the family's rabbinic advisors to have input into these discussions. Ultimately, it becomes a medical decision. The final decision is the medical decision. But a good doctor worth his salt will be happy to listen to the family's views, and if the family requests, religious views as well. And that goes for other religions too. So let's spend some time now talking about the different types of euthanasia, and what is and isn't allowed, and where we are in the world today. So we'll go through a few of the different types, and then we'll talk about a few different countries where we are, and then we'll finish off by talking about where we are in Israel. So let's talk the easy bit first. Active euthanasia. A person is alive. Doesn't matter whether they're a ghost face or they're not a ghost safe. And you come along and they say, Doc, I want to die. Here's my arm, inject me with something, do me in. That's not allowed. Okay, that is called murder. Okay, al pi halacha, that's murder. You cannot end a person's life with an action. That's easy. Okay. Now, let's just go slight. If we call that the left-hand side to me, you're right. Left-hand side of the spectrum. Let's go a little bit in, and we're on to assisted suicide. Okay. Now, if a person wants to commit suicide, wants to end their own life, well, then they'll end their own life. But what if they want to end their own life, but they can't do it? They don't have the facilities, the means, the practical skills to do it. There is something called physician-assisted suicide, where in certain countries, you can ask a doctor, if there are certain criteria are met, you can ask a doctor to assist you to do the suicide. Now that assistance might be to draw up the morphine or whatever it is they're going to use. It might be to put the syringe in their hand. It might be whatever other assistance they need. But the act itself is done by the patient. That's the distinction. You understand the distinction between the first one and the second one. The second one, the act, is done by the patient, but they need assistance to do it. If you're not a doctor and you do that, and or if you are a doctor but the patient doesn't fit the criteria, you can be accused of possibly manslaughter. Probably wouldn't be murder because you haven't actually done the act, but you would certainly be an accessory to the fact. It would be not allowed. Now, so there we've moved a little bit away from that. Now we come to passive euthanasia, meaning I am going to not do something to prevent the person dying. So the silly example I gave you where somebody's cut their artery and you just stand by and watch them bleed to death. Okay, I'm not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who's in the process of dying. They've started the journey from life to death, and there is something that you could do to slow that process down. So if we take our Mishnah example, you could go and call a wood chopper and say, come, chop the wood, and you'll prevent the neshama from leaving. The equivalent today would be to give palliative care. I'm not talking about palliation of pain here. That's a separate issue altogether, which we will come to. So you could give somebody fluids, you could give somebody food, you could give somebody oxygen. Give you a very personal example. A very personal example. My father, Zichrono Livracha, was in the throes of dying. We knew he was in the hospital. He had an oxygen mask on his face. He was linked up to all the bits and bobs, and I'm watching all the figures there that are going on. I can see his heart rate, and I can see his oxygen saturations and what have you. And he's uncomfortable with this oxygen mask. It's distressing him, and he's pulling at it. While he's got his oxygen mask on, his oxygen saturations remained, reasonable. But once he took it off, they plummeted pretty quickly. And it was clear that if he didn't have this oxygen mask on, it wasn't going to be long before it would dip below the level where it couldn't be sustained. So, would I be allowed to take the oxygen mask off my father? No, because that's an act. I'm doing something there. But when he clawed at it and took it off himself, I don't have an obligation to put it back. Okay, see the distinction? So I didn't want to take that decision myself. You know, it's hard enough doing it for other folk, but you know, when you lose all objectivity with your own family, I was on the phone straight away to my Rebbe, described the situation, told him the scenario, and asked for his advice, and I followed his advice, which was that if he took it off and it was distressing him, we didn't have to put it back on. And that's what we did. And a few minutes later, he passed away peacefully. So that's a type of passive euthanasia. Another example might be medication that's keeping a person alive in a drip. Okay, let's say they've got, I don't know, adrenaline going in a drip, keeping their heartbeat up. And without the adrenaline, the heartbeat would gradually slow down and stop. Are you allowed to take the drip out? No, because you're doing an act then. When the adrenaline runs out in that drip, do you have to replace the adrenaline drip? No. It's called in Hebrew, Shev Va'al Ta'aseh. What does that mean in Hebrew? Shev, sit, Va'al Ta'aseh, and don't do anything. Don't sit. So when that adrenaline in the drip runs out, it runs out. And you do not have to replace it in that scenario. Yes? Well, you'd hope that you would have the conversation, and this would be a planned management of the patient. Yeah, that you'd have that conversation. It's a fair question. Let me just repeat the question. If there was a nurse standing there, wouldn't they replace the drip? If there was no conversation had and nothing recorded, and it was just, yes, you would have to do that because, but the idea is that we have our, if you like, our ducks in line before we get to that situation, or when we get to that situation. Now, the difficulty comes when you can't actually do that. So, for example, somebody who is in the process of dying, who's on a ventilator, okay? What does a ventilator do? It breathes for you, and it's done by electricity. So as long as that machine is plugged in, then your breathing is done for you, or the patient's breathing is done for them. Are you allowed to unplug it?
Not, except I believe you can unplug it, the battery will carry on, and when the battery dies, the patient.
Correct. So the simple answer to my question is no, you cannot unplug it. So how do we get around this in places like Laniado and Shari Tzedek, which are hospitals that run as best as they possibly can on halachic grounds, is exactly as Harvey has said. There is a backup battery on these machines. You have to have it, obviously, because if you have a power cut, not unheard of, you know, and maybe the generator of the hospital will pack in as well. Each machine has a backup battery. So what you do is, if you unplug that machine, you are not stopping the machine working. What you're doing is letting it go onto its battery, onto its backup battery. And then what you do in that situation is you allow the battery to run out. And now, a lot of people will say, well, that's just a trick, isn't it? It's like selling your chomets to a guy on Pesach or before Pesach. You know, that's a trick, isn't it? Well, yeah, if you want to look at it that way. If that's how you view it, then halacha is not important to you. But there are many people that want to keep the halacha, and want to feel that they have done whatever they possibly can for their loved one, and at the same time, not broken halacha, and not broken a pretty important one, do not murder, pretty important. So to those scoffers who will say, well, you're just messing around, sort of semantics, you're just playing, I would say, look inside your soul and find a place that you can say, actually, there's some value to this. Yes, Harvey?
One has, it's quite common, I think, one has a situation where someone is terminally ill and in great pain and has morphine. And I'm assured by people that sometimes the doctor gives that little bit extra of morphine to ease that person's suffering permanently.
Okay.
You would say that's active.
Okay, brilliant question, and I couldn't have planted it better because it takes me right into my next subject. Thank you very much. So for the recording, Harvey said that he's aware of situations whereby somebody's on morphine for pain relief and the doctor might give a little bit extra to end their suffering permanently. Now, there's a lot in that we need to unpack. Morphine, we'll use morphine as an example. It doesn't have to be morphine, but we use morphine as an example. Works as a painkiller. If you give too much of it, it depresses your respiration and the heart rate, and it will kill you. So, you have a patient who requires, let's say, 100 milligrams of morphine to relieve their pain. Let's say it takes 150 milligrams of morphine to end their life. The doctor comes along and gives 150 milligrams of morphine. Now, I'm going to quote what Harvey said. He said, to end their suffering permanently. Now, if that was the intention, when he gave that injection of 150 milligrams of morphine, the intention, in English we call it mens rea. Well, it's not English, is it? That's Latin. But in Latin, in English usage of the Latin, we call it mens rea. In Hebrew, we call it kavana, intention.
Not machshavat chila.
No, intent, kavana. What is the intention when you gave that injection? If the intention was to end the life permanently, then that is murder. However, if the same injection was given to ease the pain with no intention of shortening the life, even though you know it might end their life, but your intention was to relieve their pain, and you had no intention to shorten their life, just to remove their pain, but you accepted that there may be a shortening of the life, that is not only permissible, but commendable, because you have eased a person's suffering. Now, who knows what the intention of the injector of the morphine is? Well, who does know? God knows. Who else? The person doing it, and nobody else. Anybody here, Charlie will know about this case. Anybody remember or ever read about the case of Dr. David Moore? Yeah, you remember that, Charlie? David Moore was a GP in Newcastle, in the northeast of England. Anybody here from Newcastle? Lovely place. Okay. David Moore was a Newcastle GP, and he went to the pub one day and bragged about, I'm putting it in awful terms, but this is basically what he did. He bragged about the fact that he had ended lots of people's lives with morphine injections when they were in the last throes of their life. And he took it upon himself to be this mercy killer. And everybody said, good for you, great. The only problem was that, yeah, he got arrested. Because the silly boy gave an interview on the BBC about it. Anyway, cut a long story short, he went to trial and he was acquitted because at trial he said, I never ever intended to shorten anyone's life. I only ever gave them the medication to relieve their pain. It's not what he said in the pub, but the jury believed him, or at least they was not beyond all reasonable doubt, and he was acquitted. But it was, and then he went on. He was a strange fellow, I think. He then came back afterwards and said he'd do it all over again, despite what he went through. He became an alcoholic. And he died quite young, actually, in his 50s, very sadly. But you can. The case was a very. No. The case was very important because it demonstrated exactly the point that you were making, Harvey. That kavanah, intention, the intention, and this is the halakha. The halakha is, it depends on your intention. Now, there is a caveat to that. Remember I said that this was okay as long as it might shorten the life. What if it definitely would shorten the life? So in other words, a person is given 15,000 milligrams of morphine, enough to kill an elephant, right? There's no way that that's not going to kill the person, okay? So that in Hebrew, in halakha, is called, anybody know? Go on. Very good, Neville. A psik ratio. Psik ratio. Do you know what it means? It does mean that, but do you know what the actual words mean?
Psik is a comma.
No, not that kind of psik. Psik ratio, it means a cut-off head. Let me explain to you. Because if I explain to you what a psik ratio is, you'll understand how inevitable we've got to be. It comes from the halachot of Shabbat. You'll all know that it is forbidden on Shabbat to shech the chicken. Yeah? Forbidden. Shechita is one of the 39 av malachot. A child comes to his father on Shabbat. This is a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. If a child comes to his father and says, Daddy, I want a chicken's head to play with. I want to play with the chicken's head. They didn't have toys in those days. They didn't have Lego or, well, that's what they played with. They played with chicken's heads. Right? Okay. So the father says, okay, uncle, you want a chicken's head? I don't happen to have one here, but we've got a chicken there. I'll shack the chicken and I'll give you the head. He cannot turn around and say, I didn't want to shack the chicken. I didn't want to kill the chicken. I just wanted his head so Yankel could play with it. If you give the head of the chicken to Yankel, it's inevitable, 100% inevitable that chicken is going to be dead. Right? That's called a psik ratio. Okay, it means cut off the head. So one second, I'll come back to you in a sec. So this concept of psik ratio is important when it comes to this halacha. So you've got the same patient and the same dose of morphine. If the intention is to end their life, even if it's a dose that might not end their life, but does. So let's say you didn't expect 50 milligrams to end their life, but you intended to have a go, and they did die, that's murder. On the other hand, you give a big dose, which might, even probably, would end their life sooner, even probably. That's permitted, as long as your intention was to relieve the pain and only to relieve the pain, and you did not have the intention of shortening their life. Only you know, the Almighty. But that's the scenario. However, you come along and you give this patient a whacking big dose that is 100% inevitable as a chicken with his head chopped off, then that you can't turn around and say, oh, I didn't intend to kill the patient. I just wanted to give him a kilogram of morphine to relieve his pain. No, you can't say that. Okay, that doesn't work. So we've moved along the spectrum here from active euthanasia. You can't do something with the intention of killing somebody. Assisted suicide, difficult in halacha because you're actually facilitating that, and you're not allowed al pi halacha to facilitate somebody to do an aveira. If Avril says to me, Johnny, I'm dying for a cheeseburger. Make me a cheeseburger. I'm dying to eat a cheeseburger. And I go make her a cheeseburger and I give it to her. I'm not allowed to do that. I can't be a shaliach for an aveira. So you can't, physician-assisted suicide in halacha, can't do that. Where there is, I said I'd come back to me. Let me just finish this sentence and I'll come back to you. Where there is room for the interpretation of halacha is in the passive euthanasia and in the heroics, the do not attempt resuscitation, the jumping on somebody's chest when they, in theory, anybody who dies, in theory, you could have a go at resuscitating, couldn't you? Right? Once you have anybody whose heart stops, if you're there when it happens, do CPR. We all know how to do it. We've been on our courses and we've got our defibrillator. I'm sure you've got one here somewhere. Haven't you? Yeah, upstairs. Okay. So we don't do heroics in those situations because we're asking our question all the time: are we prolonging life or are we extending death? So that's where the subtleties come in that angle. Yes, sorry, I'll come back to you.
Sorry to keep talking about it, but you, especially as a doctor, should know or would know, have been taught that 100 milligrams of morphine is okay, but 150 is more than likely, especially if the patient is suffering, has no resistance, cancers, etc. You would know, you've done enough training, that 150 is going to kill them. Okay,
well, that's a perfectly fair point, and that's exactly the point I was making. If you know that 150 is going to do them in, and by the way, I even used 150 as an example, those cancer patients, particularly who have had lots of morphine over the years, who are not what's called opiate naive, can have enormous doses of morphine without it killing them. They get tremendous resistance to it. So
They get resistance to pain too.
they get resistant to pain, they get resistant to painkillers. So, and they get resistant to the side effects. So the point, one sec, the point that you make, Harvey, is absolutely right. It is an informed decision, okay? And when the person makes that decision, it's with the knowledge. Of course, you don't have a lay person saying, oh, how much shall I give? No idea, well, chuck it in, right? It's an informed, exactly as you say, it's an informed decision. Yes, Philip.
Is that why they've introduced fentanyl? Is fentanyl a more potent painkiller than morphine?
100 micrograms of fentanyl is the equivalent of 240 milligrams of morphine. Yeah. Okay. So where have we got to? Because we're running out of time, I guess, haven't we? Right. Let's just briefly. Okay. Before I go on to the different countries and then finish off with Israel, any particular questions about where we've got in the spectrum of halakha? Is it clear where there is what I'll call wiggle room and where there isn't?
Yeah, can go back to this scenario before that you mentioned, somebody on a ventilator. Person's been kept alive by a ventilator. The doctor comes along and says, I'm terribly sorry, but if you take that ventilator off, the person will die. Question is, al pi halakha, what should one do? Should one believe the doctor, or should one leave the ventilator?
Okay, the question is, somebody's on a ventilator, doctor says this is futile now, you're just ventilating somebody, we take the ventilator off, he's going to die. What does halakha say about taking the ventilator off? Well, you can't unplug it, because that's an act, okay? If you're in Chutz La'aretz, you can't stop the doctor from doing it. You can express your wish, but you can't stop them from doing it because it's a medical decision. Which is the situation we had with that boy that I told you about who was in the car accident. What can you do? You can do the Laniado Shared Tzedek situation that we discussed. The decision that is made is a medical decision. If the medical decision is that treatment is futile and that is accepted, then you take halachic advice from people that know what they're talking about. But ultimately, the decision would be to, in an acceptable way, remove the futile treatment. And that doesn't necessarily mean move into a ventilator, it's antibiotics, whatever it is. Where if it's a futile treatment, then it doesn't need to be continued. You had a question.
In their end of life medicine, and then you're left to make decisions. Does that change the halacha?
Good question. Good question. Question was, if a patient expresses wishes either at the time that we're talking that they are in extremis, or in a directive, a pre, what do they call it? Advanced power of attorney document, that kind of thing. Now, and we'll come to that in a minute when I talk about Israel, because that's part of it. So, in other words, do we take into account the patient's wishes? That's the nub of that question, yeah? So, the answer is yes and no. No, if the patient says, kill me, right? You don't have to listen to a patient who says to you, do a cardinal avera of killing me, right? I'm alive, there's my arm, inject me with enough stuff to kill me. No, the answer is we don't follow that. The yes bit is that, of course, we do everything that we can in order to follow their wishes within the bounds of halacha. So, in other words, take it both ways. A person says, I had an aunt who passed away actually 1 year ago yesterday, English dates. She was 105 and she was all there right to the end. She, on various number of occasions, Vivian knew her well, various number of occasions, she said, I definitely want to be resuscitated. No way am I signing a DNAR, right? Now, you have a patient who says, I want to be resuscitated. In that scenario, then I think, yes, I think the halacha does take that into account. Even though in a normal situation you would say you're not obliged to do so, then I think that the patient's wishes would be taken into account. The difficulty is when it's the other way around. When the patient is well and truly alive and says, and this is why the bills are being, and the laws are being brought in various places. People want to die for whatever reason it may be. They may have a terrible illness, they may have terrible pain, they may have terrible circumstances that they're in, and they may want to die. But again, unless they're asking you to do something which is permissible, then you can't do it. Right? So you can't ever do an act which is going to reduce somebody's life, even if they want you to do so. Because if that was the case, then every country would allow physician-assisted suicide for everybody. It's patient's wishes, autonomy. Okay. So the answer is yes and no. Every case obviously is taken into account. But we certainly don't ignore the patient's wishes. We do whatever we possibly can within the bounds of halacha to make to keep the patient's wishes going. I just want to talk for the last couple of minutes, if I can, about euthanasia in different countries. There is a little handout here. It might be a bit out of date this now, to be honest. So I did update the UK bit because that's very current at the moment. Let's talk about the UK first of all. There's a Suicide Act 1960. Any lawyers here? Any British lawyers? Yes, okay. Not your specialist subject. Well, okay, good. I'm happy for you. I can't imagine that was much fun to be a specialist in suicide. Anyway, under the Suicide Act in 1961, euthanasia and assisted suicide are criminal offences in the UK. And it can result in a murder charge, as per Dr. Moore, we talked about him. Aiding or even counselling someone in relation to taking their own life is punishable by up to 14 years imprisonment.
Not in Belgium.
He's talking about.
I'm talking about the UK, Philip. Okay, so, however, on the 29th of November 2024, a bill passed its second reading in the Commons, a bill called Terminally Ill Adults, brackets, End of Life, close brackets, bill. And it passed by 330 votes to 275. And that is the furthest that a assisted suicide bill has ever got in the UK. That's not to say it will come into law. If you read the so-called pundits who think they know what they're talking about, they're divided. I think most people think it won't be passed this time around, but if it's not this time around, it will be next time around. So you can be pretty sure that in the not too distant future, physician-assisted suicide will be legal in the UK under certain circumstances. I'm not going to go into the actual nub of what you've got to do to be able to be in that situation, because we haven't got time. You can read it up. There are, of course, places where it's been permitted for a long time. The Netherlands, Switzerland is probably the most famous. Dignitas, yeah, Belgium. Okay. Now, even in Switzerland, where there is no minimum age, no diagnosis, and no symptom state, you can go along and say, that's it. Pay your money, you get your thing. However, assisted suicide, even in Switzerland, is deemed illegal if the motivations are selfish. For example, if somebody assisting the death stands to inherit. Oh, just so happened, oh yes, Granny asked me to assist her suicide. Just so happens that I've got a debt of 100 grand. The Granny is leaving me 100 grand in her will. Just a coincidence, Your Honour. No, can't do that. Okay. How many people do you think, I've only got figures from 2018, how many people do you think travelled to the Dignitas clinic in 2018? You might be surprised at this figure.
65.
Philip says 165. Any?
221.
I'm glad you can still read, Charlie. 221. I thought that was quite low, actually. I thought it would have been more. But there it is. Okay, let's just finish off by telling you what the situation is in Israel, because it's quite interesting. So, the thing about Israel is that, as I said right at the beginning, we try in this country to tread a difficult compromise line between halacha and modernity. It doesn't always feel like we're trying that hard, particularly when the chief rabbinate is very political and very connected with one particular group of people, let's say. But generally speaking, the philosophy has been that this should be a modern state for Jewish people, not a halachic state. Okay? If it's a halachic state, you really wouldn't like it, because it would mean that, for example, if on Sukkot, Harvey decided he didn't want to shake his Lulav and Esrog, the Lulav and Esrog police could come and beat you up until you did it. That's a halacha. If a person refuses to do a mitzvah aseh, the halacha is that you beat him until he does it. So none of us would want to go down what would be a pure halachic state, and that never was the scenario even back in the day. But we do try to have our philosophy educated by and influenced by halacha. So, for example, you can read it on here. Israeli penal law forbids causing the death of another person and specifically forbids shortening the life of another person. Active euthanasia is forbidden both by Israeli law and Jewish law. There was a Steinberg commission set up by Professor Abraham Steinberg, an amazing man. Any of you got or seen the encyclopedia, of Refuah? It's brilliant. It's written by him, edited by him. And he set up a commission to see how this would work in Israel. And in Israel, whilst it is forbidden to assist actively, there are places like Laniado and like Sharet Tzedek, which go out of their way to preserve this concept of treating a ghost like they should be treated, not preventing somebody's death and not prolonging somebody's death, and taking into account all the halachic things that we've said. So, as near as is possible, the Israeli law as it stands at the moment is as close as we're going to get to what is a working halachic process. Does it suit everybody? No. The Haredi population don't accept brain death. The Israeli chief rabbinate does accept brain death. There is a big problem there, because if you don't accept brain death, then you can't have these transplants that we talked about. So there's a problem with that. It's not perfect, but it's as close as we can get. And the reason I mentioned Professor Steinberg, Rabbi Professor Steinberg, is that when you have people of the caliber of Professor Abraham Steinberg and his predecessor, Rabbi Professor Abraham, anybody heard of him? He was my Rebbe. I'm very proud to say. He was my Rebbe for medical ethics, taught me everything I know from going back 30 odd years. He was a pediatric neurologist in Sharet Tzedek. He's sadly suffering from dementia today in a Jerusalem old people's home. Awful to see. An amazing person. Rabbi Steinberg, who's I think he's a neurologist as well, took over from him. And these are the kind of caliber of people who are advising our government and advising the lawmakers. I can tell you, this is a minefield, this topic, as we can see. We spent nearly an hour and a half on, we're nowhere even just scratching the surface. But when we've got the caliber of people like Professor Abraham and Professor Steinberg, we can be sure that we've got the best that we possibly can. Like everything else in this country, it isn't perfect, but it's better than anything else, anywhere else. So I think that we can be comfortable in that scenario. Obviously, every individual situation has to be taken on its merits. Bottom line, you always see this at the end of everything. Ask a competent rabbi, ask a competent doctor. In this situation, ask both. Yeah.
One quick question. If, as you say, that turning off a ventilator is active suicide, in Israel that's not permitted? That doesn't happen? Or that doesn't...
I didn't say it didn't happen. Again, the question, I'll just repeat the question. Do ventilators get switched off in Israel? Yes, they do. Is it allowed by the law? Yes, it is, if that person is declared dead, because brain death is a legal entity in Israel. Yeah.
Here in Israel affect the provision of hospice care, because it doesn't seem to be as prevalent as it is in England, where many of my own father and friends passed away in hospices.
Okay, so the question was, does the halachic input mean that there is less place for palliative care, as it seems to be less prominent in Israel than it does in the UK? You want to answer that question, Vivian?
Yes, I would.
Okay,
In hospice care, end of life care is something that happens out of the house. Here in Israel, they do their very best to try and ensure that it happens in a warm, loving environment, if that is what home is. It's unfortunately something we are experiencing. They have an amazing palliative care service. One of the very first things they do is provide you with the advanced directives to look at various scenarios. If you are in this state, do you wish to be revived? If you are in that state, do you wish to have tubes? All of those considerations. And I can tell you, Baruch Hashem, but unfortunately, Charlie's been through the intensive care situation in Laniago. He was on a ventilator, life support for 2 weeks for the first time round, 5 weeks for the second time around. He's sitting here tonight. Had he have been in Britain, and the first time round was in the middle of COVID. The first time round, he would have just pulled the ventilator off it and said, "We're giving it someone younger, fitter, forget it."
okay, let me repeat all that for the recording. They're dying to hear what you've got to say. Sorry about the pun. So what Vivian said was that here in Israel, the palliative care concentrates more on the home, whereas in the UK, there is more of a hospice situation. My experience is that palliative care in the UK is actually very good. I've no experience of it in Israel. Vivian tells us, and she has experience, that it's excellent here as well. So I think, you know, whether it's in the home or it's in a hospice situation, let's hope it's good. One of the objections, by the way, and this is an important point, I'm glad you raised the hospice situation. One of the important objections against the physician-assisted suicide is that it will detract from palliative care. A lot of the people who are against physician-assisted suicide are not against the concept of it, but are saying that people will take the easy way out, and rather we should be putting our efforts into improving and increasing palliative care and knowing more about it and treating them better, and not putting our resources into physician-assisted suicide. And while I'm just mentioning it, one of the problems that is a very big problem, and this has been shown with research in places where physician-assisted suicide is already in existence, and that is that voluntary euthanasia, in other words, somebody says, "I want to die," in other words, the right to die, can become the obligation to die. Now, what do I mean by that? This is a really important point. So sorry to keep you waiting to going home and everything, but this is an important point, and we'll end with this. Imagine that you are, no, not you, a person, right? I don't want to say you, a person is at end of life, however long, whatever that means. Let's say they've got a terminal illness and they need round-the-clock care. Okay, how much is that going to cost? A lot of money. Let's put a figure on it. Okay, that's going to cost 5,000 shekels a week, let's say 10,000 shekels a week, right? To have your round-the-clock care. You know that you might live another 12 weeks. That's going to cost you 120,000 shekels in that care. There is a very strong motive, thank you, to say, you know what, do me in, I'd rather give the 120,000 shekels to my kids. Or worse than that, the kids say, "Oh, Daddy, are you sure you don't want a physician-assisted suicide? Right? I'm sure it would be much nicer for you than lingering on for another 12 weeks, in brackets, spending my inheritance," right? Think about it. This is not at all out of the range. I can tell you something. again, I'll finish with this personal story about my father again. My father, for the last 5 weeks of his life, was not well at all, in hospital, and gradually passed away. Baruch Hashem, he'd always had his private medical insurance. At one time, actually, he was going to give it up, and I said, "Don't give it up, Daddy. That you might just need it one day. Don't give it up. Better that you keep your car another couple of years, or don't go on holiday this year. And if you really need it, I'll pay for it, but don't give it up." Anyway, he didn't. Baruch Hashem, didn't cost him a penny. I am absolutely certain that if he had to pay for that in the Alexandra Hospital in Cheadle at 300 quid a night for 5 weeks, work it out, a lot, I'm absolutely certain he would have said, if he had the choice, I'm not spending all that money on that. Do me in, rather give it to the kids. I'm 100% certain that's what he would think. And that is a very dangerous situation. And that is one of the main objections, let's do it halacha, one of the main objections that the secular world raises against physician-assisted suicide. There are many things that they say positive about it, but that is a scenario which is foreseeable, predictable, and I'll go as far as to say inevitable. Okay, I think I've kept you long enough, so we'll call it a day.